Who wrote the fourth gospel? In this video, we will discuss four primary perspectives. First, we will look at the possibility that the Apostle John, son of Zebedee, wrote it. This is, of course, the traditional perspective. We will also consider the possibility that a different John wrote it, a so-called John the Elder. Then we will look at the possibility of Lazarus, who was raised from the dead. And finally, we will consider the notion that doubting Thomas wrote the gospel. Before we discuss these four perspectives, though, we need to talk about the superscriptions. And the superscriptions are the parts that say the gospel according to Matthew, or the gospel according to Mark, etc. Conservative and liberal scholars alike do not trust the superscriptions. They do not believe that the superscriptions were present at the beginning of the composition. They believe that later on, scribes added these superscriptions. And there's a number of reasons for this. Sometimes superscriptions are at the beginning of a manuscript, sometimes they're at the end, sometimes they're at the top of every page. And since they do not have a stable, established position, that's kind of a telltale sign that the superscriptions were not present at the beginning of the manuscript tradition, that they were added later. Another reason is one that is described for us by Witherington. If this title had been attached to the Gospel before the fourfold collection, we would have expected it to read the Gospel of John, not the Gospel according to John, because the latter expression surely implies that there were tellings of the Gospel according to others. And so this form of a title would be used to distinguish this Gospel from the others with which it was placed together. In other words, if the author was going to add a superscription, you would expect him to say the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John. But since all the Gospels say the Gospel according to, this means that this superscription was not added to any of the Gospels until they had already been collected together in a fourfold collection, which obviously didn't happen on the day they were written. That happened later. And so we know these superscriptions come later because they reflect the time that these were all put together and circulated as a fourfold collection. And therefore, the superscriptions are not helpful to us. They reflect a later tradition, and the tradition may be right, it may be wrong, but nevertheless, the superscriptions should not be considered to be part of the original composition on the day that these documents were written, and so we're going to have to look to other types of evidence. First, we want to discuss the possibility that the Apostle John, one of the 12, the one who is the son of Zebedee and the brother of James, did he write the Gospel of John? Now, we're going to look at two different types of evidence. External evidence, that is early Christian voices from the church fathers, and also internal evidence, evidence within the book itself. Let's begin with external evidence. The earliest church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, Ignatius, and Polycarp, avoid citing the fourth gospel. Now, some think this is because they do not have this fourth gospel, or because they don't believe in it if they do have it. But more likely, the earliest church fathers are avoiding the fourth gospel because Gnostics had used this gospel so effectively against the church, and so some of these early authors are very ambivalent about using it because they don't want to fire off a gun that will shoot back in their faces. Some have looked at the writings of Justin Martyr and said, oh no, you can see the influence of John's gospel even if he doesn't quote John's gospel. Now, Tatian used the fourth gospel as the historical basis of his harmonization of the four gospels in his diatessaron. Dia means through, tesseron means four. So through comparing the four gospels, he tried to give us the first harmonization of the gospels. And when he did this, he used the fourth gospel as the one that he thought had the best historical sequence, the most reliable chronology, and then he tried to take the other three gospels and make them fit in with the fourth gospel. And all this really shows for us is that early on in the 2nd century, the fourth gospel already had tremendous weight and authority. However, it doesn't do much to help us determine who wrote it. Irenaeus, around the year 180, attributes it to an apostle named John. Now, for many, that seals the deal. When he talks about an apostle named John, he's talking about one of the 12, the son of Zebedee. Now, there are some, though, that will say Irenaeus, calls lots of people apostles, including Paul, including John the Baptist, the 70 people that Jesus sends out in Luke chapter 10. He uses the term apostle pretty lightly. And so this could be a different John, some will say. But others are persuaded. He's talking about an apostle named John. He's most likely talking about the son of Zebedee. Theophilus of Antioch attributes it to John, son of Zebedee, in the year 181. Now, this is about 100 years after the book is written, but nevertheless, it's indisputable. Theophilus thinks this is John, one of the 12, the son of Zebedee. Now, the Muratorian Canon prologue, a late 2nd century work, attributes the gospel to a John. And again, the debate rages on. Is he talking about John, the son of Zebedee, or a different John? We will discuss another John later. The church fathers seem to know about another John who was eyewitness to the life of Jesus, and that's where the confusion really comes in. Is it John, son of Zebedee, or is it this other character whom we call John the Elder? And the Muratorian Canon is a document in the 2nd century when the church was still trying to work out which books were going to be included in the New Testament. This was not finally resolved till the 4th century. But back in the 2nd century, there was already a lot of debate about this. The Muratorian Canon, for example, does not accept the book of Hebrews, James, 1st or 2nd Peter, and it's unclear if the author accepts 2nd and 3rd John. And he seems to have some affections for a document called the Apocalypse of Peter. Nevertheless, we know that Hebrews and James and the documents ascribed to Peter and John, that they would eventually end up in the New Testament. But in the 2nd century, a handful of books that are now in the New Testament were very debatable. Nevertheless, the Muratorian Canon does ascribe the gospel to a character named John. The Acts of John and the Epistles of the Apostles are mid to late 2nd century works which name John the son of Zebedee as author. And so we have a number of 2nd century documents that say a person named John wrote it. And in some of these, it's definitely John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles. And so there's a considerable voice from tradition which says John, son of Zebedee, wrote the book. Now, Craig Keener is going to respond to a mood in recent academia. There's kind of a bias built into the system. A lot of people disregard the church fathers. Well, who cares what the church fathers say? What do they know? But when we have ancient voices that discuss other documents, say Plato or say Julius Caesar or some other historical figures, we take them seriously. But in New Testament studies, we don't take ancient voices seriously. And Craig Keener suggests that that comes from a kind of a bias. He says external evidence is allowed to weigh more heavily in classical studies than it is in New Testament studies, where the burden of proof is sometimes stacked so securely against the authorship of some documents that no amount of evidence seems adequate to challenge it. If the external tradition is strong, the burden of proof should remain on those challenging traditional authorship. So Craig Keener, he writes 2 massive volumes on the Gospel of John, an indispensable work for those of us who want to really study the Gospel of John. And Keener, he's a first-rate scholar, and he thinks that John, son of Zebedee, wrote the gospel. And he's very skeptical of the skeptics because he knows that ancient voices of attestation are taken seriously in other fields of study. It's just when it comes to the New Testament, suddenly people do not take the ancient voices so seriously. And Craig Keener says, no, we have considerable evidence from the church fathers that John, son of Zebedee, wrote this, and he says we should stick with the church fathers on that point. Now we want to begin to look at internal evidence. Where does the author show up in the book? There are about a handful of places where the author shows up, and he never identifies himself by name. He calls himself the one whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple is what we're going to call him. Now, the gospel says that he was an eyewitness to Jesus' life, and that his testimony has been preserved in this gospel by himself or a secretary. We'll talk about secretaries later. His first unambiguous appearance is at the last meal, as the one reclining next to Jesus. So the night that Jesus is betrayed, he has a meal with his disciples, and the beloved disciple is right next to him. Now, this is relatively late in the story in chapter 13. And it could be that he shows up earlier. He's just not identified as the beloved disciple. But the first time the beloved disciple definitely shows up is in chapter 13. He shows up again at the time of the crucifixion. He is with Jesus' mother at the foot of the cross. He's with Peter at the empty tomb on Sunday morning. He's at Jesus' resurrection appearance in Galilee when they catch 153 fish. And there are some debatable appearances. There's a disciple who gains access to the high priest's house when Jesus' trial is taking place. And, he's there and he gets Peter in. This may be the beloved disciple. We're not sure. Many will say it is, and I think it probably is too. And there's another debatable appearance. In the first chapter, there's an unnamed disciple who comes to Jesus with Andrew after having followed John the Baptist. And so these are all the places where the beloved disciple, the author, either shows up or potentially shows up. The last two are debatable, but the other ones are definitely the beloved disciple. And so we just look at each one of these scenes and we try to make inferences to determine who the beloved disciple is. Is it John, the son of Zebedee, or is it someone else? The author knew the geography of the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, suggesting that he either lived there or he visited there quite often. He was very familiar with Jewish religious practices, suggesting that he's Jewish. And the beloved disciple lived to be very old, fueling the rumor that he was to remain alive until Jesus returned. This gospel ends with squashing a rumor. There's this notion that the author of this gospel was never supposed to die. And so what it looks like has taken place is he has died when this gospel is in circulation. And so at the end, there's an appendage to let you know that he wasn't supposed to live all the way till the second coming, that was a misunderstanding of something that Jesus said. And so these are the things we know about the beloved disciple. These are the places he shows up in the book, and these are the other aspects of his profile that can be deduced rather easily. Some suggest that it was not John, son of Zebedee, who wrote this, but it was a different John, the elder John. And we're going to look at both perspectives. But notice here, the beloved disciple is likely one of the 12, considering he sits next to Jesus at the last meal. Many are going to say this can't be some other John who's not one of the 12. He's got to be one of the 12 because he's sitting right next to Jesus at the last meal. Now, how could somebody sit in the most intimate position right next to Jesus if he's not even one of his 12 apostles? The beloved disciple is often paired with Peter, and in the synoptics, Peter is often grouped with James and John. Now, many are going to say this is evidence that John the son of Zebedee wrote this gospel, because in the synoptics, you have the 12 apostles, and then you have an inner group that's Peter, James, and John. Well, as we read this gospel, John is, always really close to Peter. And so an inference would suggest that the author must necessarily be either James or John. Now, James dies early according to the book of Acts in chapter 12. And so this only leaves one person, John the son of Zebedee, because the beloved disciple, again, lives to be very old according to the last chapter of this book. And if it's somebody who's really close to Peter, we only got two guys, James and John. James dies early, and so this only leaves John. And so for many, just on this process of elimination, we've discovered who the author is, that it would be John the son of Zebedee. The author is kinder to Galilee than he is to Judea. The reason this is significant is it may reflect an author's bias, a favorable bias toward his hometown. If the author is John the son of Zebedee, well, he comes from Galilee. And so the reason he might be much nicer to Galilee than he is to Judea is because he's a Galilean. And this makes sense, that the author would just have a basic favoritism toward his own place of origin. This is a feature of writing, ancient and modern. And so John the Elder, the other John, he's usually understood to be a Judean, but the son of Zebedee, John the son of Zebedee, is a Galilean, and so this makes sense because he's so nice to Galilee. In chapter 21, the author, the beloved disciple, is one of the 7 who experienced the miraculous catch of fish. The fishing passage really is crucial because we know that the author is there, and we know there's only 7 people there, and we get a list of the 7. Simon Peter, and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So we know the beloved disciple is there, and we know that John is there, right? So the author is present. Now, almost certainly, this group is meant to be part of the 12 disciples, ruling out other theories of authorship, such as Lazarus or a separate elder John. Now, if the beloved disciple is not John, this is interesting because this is the only scene in the whole gospel where John is mentioned, the son of Zebedee. And it is unlikely that such a prominent disciple would only be mentioned once throughout this entire gospel. And therefore, he's probably mentioned several times. He's probably the beloved disciple, the author that shows up in several different scenes. And if John is not the beloved disciple, again, this is just strange that such a prominent disciple would only be mentioned one time. But if he's the beloved disciple, it's not awkward at all. It's his book, and he shows up in several different scenes. We talked a moment ago about the idea of secretaries. According to this view, John wrote this material, but it was later collected and compiled to create the 4th gospel by his followers. This would likely happen after he died. He left behind a corpus of writings, and his followers have selectively chosen certain parts of those writings, and they've compiled them together to create the 4th gospel. Now, is there any evidence for this? Some people point to John 19:35, where it says, "And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe." People look at this and they say, this is in the 3rd person. Why would the author discuss himself in the 3rd person? And they'd say this suggests that the Johannine circle, his followers, are the ones who are speaking here. Now, this is not a very strong argument because we find in the ancient world that folks will oftentimes discuss themselves in the 3rd person. Josephus does this, for example, or the Greek writer Xenophon. So you can't really bank too much on this verse. Now, a much stronger one is in chapter 21. This is this disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. So you get the disciple who testified and wrote these things, and then you get a we. Well, who's the we? Well, that might be the Johannine circle. John wrote these things, he died, and now his followers are compiling these things together and they're signing off. He wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And so there you essentially have the signature of the Johannine circle. Now, there are some, like Richard Bauckham, who say this is magisterial plural. Sometimes ancient writers would discuss themselves as a we, and it's kind of strange, but it happens sometimes. Some people buy that. Others say, no, we actually do have the Johannine circle here. Now, Keener is going to respond to the skeptics again. He says, in the 19th century aftermath of historical skepticism's successes, many scholars abandoned Johannine authorship more on the basis of the shift in outlook than of any appeal to previously overlooked evidence. So what you have to understand is in the 19th century, people got really skeptical, and the people became really skeptical toward the Bible. And part of this skepticism was the way people started dating things. People started dating the Gospel of John to almost the year 200. So late that no eyewitness, not John son of Zebedee, no other eyewitness, no one from the time of Jesus could have possibly written it. That's how late they dated the book. Now, we fixed this. In the modern period, unbelieving scholars and believing scholars are agreed that this was written in the 1st century. Nevertheless, the old 19th century idea that one of the apostles couldn't have written this book, that has lingered. Even though we've fixed a lot of these bad ideas born out of skepticism, we haven't fixed them all. And there is still this bias that, no, an apostle didn't really write one of the Gospels. That's not true. And Keener is just calling this out. This is just a hangover from a more skeptical period. And we've been in the process of fixing this sort of radical skepticism for a long time. But of course, some of it still lingers. Now let's look at the evidence for the notion that a different John wrote it. The author's name is still John, but this is John the Elder, who is perhaps formerly a follower of John the Baptist, and he was from Judea, and he spent a lot of time with Jesus, especially toward the end of his life. What are the reasons for believing a different John must have written it, and that John the son of Zebedee could not have been the author? The book does not focus on the Galilean ministry of Jesus so much. Now, we talked earlier about how the author tends to be kind of nice to Galilee, but other people see it differently. Almost all of this book takes place in Judea, not in Galilee. Well, if John, the son of Zebedee, spent all that time in Galilee following Jesus, how come he doesn't write much about the Galilean ministry? And so some would say that whoever wrote this is not John, the son of Zebedee from Galilee. He must be somebody who lives in Judea, since he talks about Judea so much. This author omits crucial events that happened in Galilee, about which John the son of Zebedee could have provided eyewitness testimony, including the following. The narrative of the calling of the sons of Zebedee from their nets at the Sea of Galilee. If John, son of Zebedee, wrote this, how come he doesn't record his own calling? It's recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, but surely John, son of Zebedee, he would tell you about his own calling the first day that he went to follow Jesus. There are other in-house stories, such as the in-house story of Jesus' healing of Peter's mother-in-law, at which John was present. Jesus does these little side missions in which he'll only take 3 of his apostles. He'll take Peter, and he'll take James, and he'll take John. Well, if John is one of the few individuals privy to these events, how come he doesn't tell you about them in this gospel? You certainly would expect that he would, but this story is left out. A second in-house story about the raising of Jairus' daughter, where the 3 main disciples are present. This is huge. John watched someone get raised from the dead. Why would he leave that out of this gospel? The Transfiguration, up on the mountain where Jesus is transfigured before the eyes of his 3 most prominent disciples, John was there. Why would he leave that out? And so all these things suggest to a lot of people that the author could not be John, son of Zebedee, because he wouldn't leave out all these things if he were the author. Another example, the Gethsemane prayer session, a very intimate moment right before Jesus dies. John does not record that. Why wouldn't he record that when we know he was present at all these events? One of the more entertaining aspects of this gospel is how the author presents himself as being continually in competition with Peter. He's just a little bit more awesome than Peter, and he wants you to know that. I'll give you some examples. At the Last Supper, Peter doesn't know the identity of Jesus' betrayer, but the beloved disciple does. The beloved disciple is sitting closer to Jesus in a more intimate position with Jesus, and so Peter has to tell the beloved disciple, hey, ask Jesus who it is who's going to betray him. Peter doesn't go directly to Jesus. He has to go through the beloved disciple who is closer to Jesus. The beloved disciple is present at the cross, but in the previous scene, Peter denied Jesus, right? The beloved disciple didn't deny Jesus, Peter denied Jesus. And so there's this kind of contrast. Now, this is the funniest one to me. On Easter morning, the beloved disciple and Peter take off running to the empty tomb. And lo and behold, it's the beloved disciple who gets there before Peter. He lets you know, I ran just a little bit faster than Peter. Peter does not run as fast as me. He's the first to recognize the risen Jesus speaking to the disciples from the seashore. They're on the boat, and Jesus tells them to throw a net in on one side of the boat, and they capture all these fish. And then the beloved disciple is like, hey, that's Jesus. Peter jumps out of the boat and swims to Jesus, but Peter doesn't know. He doesn't have this perception. The beloved disciple presents himself on a number of occasions as having better perception than Peter does. If he is the other disciple in chapter 18, which he seems to be, he obtains access to the high priest's house and then has Peter admitted. So Peter wouldn't have been able to get in close to Jesus at the time of his trial were it not for the connections of the beloved disciple. Peter depended on the help of the beloved disciple. If he is the anonymous disciple from chapter 1, and again, a lot of folks think that he is, he became a follower of Jesus right before Peter did. And so you don't even see that many places where the beloved disciple interjects himself into the story, but every time he does, he's either just a little bit cooler than Peter, or Peter needed the beloved disciple to do something for him because the beloved disciple had better access or better perceptions than Peter did. Now, this means to many that the author must be someone outside the 12, since he is in some sense a rival to Peter. The notion here is that the other members of the 12 would not challenge Peter this way, and that, this may be one of the reasons that we know it's somebody who's outside the 12 because he needs these credentials. He needs to say that, yeah, I'm not one of the 12. I don't have that kind of credibility in your mind, but you need to understand that I'm a reliable eyewitness, and in fact, there are a number of instances where I had better access to information and to the right interpretation of things than Peter did. And so, as a boon to promote his own credibility, he tries to show you, yeah, I'm not one of the 12, but even the top guy in the 12, even Peter, he didn't always have access to Jesus on the level that I did. Now, some have gotten the wrong idea from this, and they have thought that this gospel represented sectarian divisions in Christianity, where you had Peter's branch of Christianity and you had John's branch of Christianity, and they are not friends. And John's branch is trying to tear down Peter and say, no, we follow John, not Peter, and John is a greater disciple than Peter was. Now, Richard Bauckham, in his excellent book, which has been such a huge contributor to New Testament scholarship in recent years, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he addresses this when he says, the point of the Gospel's portrayal of Peter is not to denigrate Peter, but to show him as the disciple who through failure and grace is enabled by Jesus to become the chief pastor of the church. The Gospel gives Peter primarily the role of shepherd. This is not at all the role of the beloved disciple. The different complementary roles of the two disciples shows that it is not rivalry between different branches of early Christianity that is at stake in their relationship. The gospel acknowledges Peter's leading role in the whole church, while claiming for the beloved disciple a role of witnessing to the truth of Jesus, which is equally significant for the whole church. In other words, it could be competing branches of Christianity if this gospel tried to negate Peter's authority and tried to assert the authority of the beloved disciple. But that doesn't happen. This gospel is happy to include the scene where Peter is Jesus' rock. Peter is the only one to whom Jesus says 3 times that go and feed my sheep. Peter is definitely presented in terms of authority as the chief under-shepherd of the church. Now, the beloved disciple never makes any claims of authority for himself. That's not what he is doing. He simply shows that when it comes to witnessing, when it comes to being able to write a gospel, that he has more credibility than anybody, even Peter, right? He doesn't take anything away from Peter's authority over the church. He's happy to show you that Peter is the chief pastor of the church, but he wants you to know that even though he makes no pastoral claims for himself in this gospel, he had access to Jesus and to certain experiences in Jesus' life and a good understanding of the things that Jesus was doing on a scale that makes him better to write a gospel than anybody. And so Peter is the chief shepherd of the church, and John is sort of the chief witness. That's how he seems to be presenting this. There doesn't seem to be any attempt here to undermine Peter as a human being or as the chief shepherd of the church. Now, someone might ask, how can we even know that there's another John, other than the John, son of Zebedee, who is a reliable eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life? Well, consider Papias, who writes early, 125 to 135, not long after the generation of the apostles. And he says, "And if anyone chanced to come who had actually been a follower of the elders, I would inquire as to the discourses of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what Philip, or what Thomas or James, or what John or Matthew or any of the Lord's disciples said, and the things which Aristion and John the elder, disciples of the Lord, say." Now notice here, he gives us a short list of voices that he thinks are especially competent to witness to the events of Jesus' life. And there are two Johns. There's John, mentioned up there with the other apostles, and then there are these other figures who are not of the 12, Aristion and John the Elder. And because we have John the Elder here, we can be confident that there was more than one John who was held in high esteem in terms of eyewitness testimony. Now, what's especially interesting about the way that Papias lists the apostles here is he lists them specifically in the same order that they appear in John's gospel. Now, that can't be an accident. And for him to list these apostles in the same order that they occur in John's gospel, and then end the list with a guy named John the Elder, may mean to us that he is thinking of the writings of John the Elder, the fourth gospel, in other words. I mentioned the Muratorian canon earlier, but I want to show you something else that has been of interest to those who believe that John the Elder wrote this gospel. The canon says, "The fourth of the gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write, he said, 'Fast with me from today to 3 days, and what will be revealed to each one, let us tell it to one another.' In the same night it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all the things in his own name, while all of them should review it." Now, the Muratorian canon is at the end of the 2nd century, and some look at the wording here, and we have John who wrote the gospel, he's one of the disciples, and then we have Andrew who's one of the apostles. And some suggest that the Muratorian canon then is reflecting a 2nd century understanding that the John who wrote this gospel was a disciple, but he wasn't one of the apostles. Is there any evidence from other writings in the New Testament? Well, when we look at 2 of the writings that are attributed to John, we see something interesting. The elder to the chosen lady and her children, from 2 John 1 verse 1. And the opening of 3 John, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. And we've seen in Papias that this guy was known as John the Elder. And then we look at 2nd and 3rd John, and he opens by calling himself the elder. And this was not common in ancient Christianity or in ancient Judaism. Yeah, we had guys who were called the elder, but it was included with their name, not simply the elder, which would suggest that whoever this is, he's old. He's been around a long time. And again, remember that John's gospel closes by letting us know that whoever its author was really old, so old that people thought he would stick around until Jesus came back. Now, certainly some of those 2nd century voices thought the John who wrote this gospel was the son of Zebedee, one of the apostles. How did they end up getting this idea if it was not in fact that John? As Klink says, this John, not the apostle, is the beloved disciple. He is not one of the 12, but is a Jerusalem disciple of Jesus. According to Bauckham, the lesser-known John the Elder was replaced by the fame of the better-known and more prestigious John the Apostle. In other words, you have 2 prominent Johns in the early church. One is well-known because he's one of the 12, and one is lesser-known. Well, if the lesser-known guy wrote this gospel, in time, not even much time, people are going to start accrediting it to the more popular John, the more well-known John. They have the same name. They're going to be easy to mix up. And since one of these guys is really well-known because he's one of the 12, he's going to end up getting credit for what the lesser known John has actually written. And so Klink here, following the lead of Bauckham and others, he is suggesting that this is what happened. This is why there was a mix-up. The lesser known John wrote this gospel, but since everybody didn't know about him, they just ended up attributing it to the more well-known John, John the son of Zebedee. Ben Witherington will summarize this view for us and the reasons why people believe it was John the Elder. The first unambiguous quotation of this gospel that ascribes it to John son of Zebedee is Theophilus, and that is some 90 years after this gospel was published, so he's not really all that concerned with voices in the church that said it was the son of Zebedee because they're relatively late. Two things that must be remembered is that by the end of the 2nd century, there was the desire and felt need to associate all the sacred traditions of Christianity with apostolic witness in order to say that these writings that we have, that they are inspired, that they are reliable, etc., people wanted to attribute all of them to apostles. And it could be that some that were not written by apostles ended up getting accredited to apostles because that was sort of the compulsion at the time. And the Gnostic controversies of the 2nd century made it especially crucial to associate the 4th gospel with apostolic testimony, since this was the favorite gospel for various Gnostics. In other words, we have to take this gospel back from the Gnostics. And the way we do that is we say that this isn't one of their gospels. This was written by the Apostle John, one of our apostles. And therefore, they can't have this book. This book belongs to us. The third perspective to consider is that Lazarus, who is raised from the dead, is the author of this book. Now, that might sound a little extravagant, but there are some interesting reasons for believing this. In John chapter 11, it says this, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So the Jews were saying, 'See how he loved him.'" Now, up to this point in the 11th chapter, we have not seen the disciple called the one Jesus loved. At no point has he shown up and been called by that epithet. But then you run into Lazarus, and everybody's like, look at how Jesus loves him. And then soon after that, this character named the beloved disciple starts showing up. Chapter 13, chapter 19, chapter 20. And why is it that you don't get the guy who Jesus loved? Then it says Jesus loved Lazarus, and then the beloved disciples start showing up. Well, some folks are going to say that's because Lazarus is the author of this book. Now, Lazarus might have connections to the high priest since he was from Bethany. Bethany was right outside of Jerusalem, and remember that the beloved disciple seems to be the one who knew the priest and was able to get Peter inside on the night of Jesus' trial. Now, this would make sense with Lazarus, since he lived so close to where the priests were, he likely would have had some connections. A resurrected author would be helpful explaining what we run into at the end of the book. Remember, folks thought that the author of this book was not supposed to die. So at the end of the book, they put that rumor to rest. Well, if it's Lazarus, that makes sense, because he was already raised from the dead. So it'd be very easy to see how a rumor could get started that Lazarus is not supposed to die. And so if he writes this gospel, he's the one who's supposed to stick around until Jesus comes back. Of course, the rumor ends up being wrong, and the author lets you know that that is wrong. But nevertheless, if it's Lazarus, it would help explain how a rumor like this gets started. Now, the fourth view to consider, the one that I don't think is very strong, but we'll talk about it briefly, is that Thomas, who demanded to see the hole in Jesus' side after the resurrection, that doubting Thomas, he wrote this gospel. Now, Thomas demands to touch Jesus' side, but it's only the beloved disciple who's at the cross of the male disciples. And so some have said, look, the beloved disciple sees a spear thrust into Jesus' side, and it's Thomas who says, I need to see the hole in Jesus' side. Therefore, Thomas and the beloved disciple must be the same. Now, this view is interesting, I guess in a kind of a superficial way, but as Keener tells us, the disciples talk. The beloved disciple could have told everybody else, hey, a spear was thrust into his side. One of the women could have done this. Word of mouth travels quickly. And so the fact that Thomas knows that a spear has been thrust into Jesus' side doesn't necessarily mean he has to be Thomas, has to be the beloved disciple who was there at the time of the crucifixion. I just don't think that is very compelling. So there you have it. There have been other views proposed. Um, the view that John, son of Zebedee, or that John the Elder wrote it, those are the two strongest views. I don't know which one is right. I think they're both pretty compelling. I don't care either way. Either way, I trust that this book is based on eyewitness testimony and that it is inspired and that it's an awesome book. The view that Lazarus wrote it, that's interesting. I think it's a strong view. It's just not as strong as the first two. This view that Thomas wrote it, I don't find very compelling at all. Now, there are some who would suggest this was written by one of the female disciples of Jesus. That's just extremely unlikely, not because women are stupid, but because women were not usually trained to write in the ancient world. And so I just doubt that is very likely. So it is probably either John the son of Zebedee or this character named John the Elder. And I've given you, most of the primary reasons for that. There are other reasons more minor reasons that I didn't include. But nevertheless, whoever wrote it, we're going to call him John, and we're going to proceed on that basis.